This is a great time for me to ask a friend, somebody that was in law enforcement, some pretty tough questions about what's going on in the world today.
Ask me anything.
So one of the questions I have, maybe just to start a baseline, is what was the genesis for you to become a police officer? And I want to caveat this because right now there is in the culture that I run around in, everybody says, who would want to be a police officer? Only the dredges of society, only the people that are looking for power and have a little man syndrome. So I think that, and I hear it, and I feel that, like, yeah, that is why people would join. But then I talk to somebody like you, and I'm wondering, I don't see that with you. So why did you join the police force, and what's changed over time?
Well, I was actually a fireman in a mid-sized city in California, and it was a fun job. I'd gone to college. I'd gone to the fire academy. I'd been a volunteer fireman since I was 16, and I'm now 20 years old, and I had really and truly captured my dream of becoming a paid fireman. And there was this one traffic accident where we were there and we were, cleaning up the spilt fuel, and we had taken care of the victims of the traffic accident. And the police officers showed up. They took the accident information down, and when it was all over for them, they got in their cars, their chariot of justice, and they drove away. And we stayed there for about 3 hours, throwing down kitty litter to soak up the fuel and to make sure the roadway's clear of all the weird parts and so forth that could puncture tires. And I thought, wait a minute, if I became a firefighter because of the adrenaline, there's a lot of adrenaline pumping in firefighting. I said, those guys, they go from call to call, and they really truly did. They were going from a traffic accident to maybe a stabbing to maybe some kind of assault. And I was 20 years old, and one night there was a knock on my door. My roommate and I were both firefighters, and a police sergeant was there, and we were 20, so we kind of had to make sure that he didn't open our refrigerator and see all of our beer. And he came in and he said, "Hey, listen, the police chief would like for you both to consider becoming police officers, and we'll pay your salary and we'll do your police academy and all this." So it was like, are you kidding me? I'm 20 years old and I'm being afforded this great opportunity. And I was raised in a very, very small town. I was raised in the town of Garberville in California, less than 3,000 people. And so I think it was just very fortuitous. This guy came to us and said, "Would you like to do it?" And I did it. And I was a police officer for 3 years. And I had gotten married. I was 36 years ago. And then my wife and I moved to Mendocino County, and I really and truly got to be a peacekeeper. Laytonville has about also. And while I was a deputy sheriff, more important than that, Vance, I was a peacekeeper. And I would not go to work saying, "Gosh, I need to take 3 people to jail today." I would not go to work saying, "I need to write 2 tickets today." I would saying, "I am going to represent the government today and do everything I can to keep the peace in this small town." And it was by far the best 3 or 4 years of my life of being a resident deputy. I was, there were a couple other guys that sometimes lived there, sometimes didn't. But I was a resident deputy of a small town. People called me Tom. They didn't call me deputy. They would come by my house, or if I was off duty in a grocery store, they would tell me who they think might have done the burglary down the street. And if you go back and look at the history of law enforcement, and you go back to the Roman Empire, they had night watchmen that they weren't called police officers. They weren't called deputy sheriffs. They were peacekeepers. And they would watch the walls of their city, and they would make sure that the peace was kept. And they weren't there to punish people or to take advantage of people. They were there because they loved their city, and they were the peacekeepers. And during this evolution of law enforcement, and basically in the 60s is when, if you go back and look, this was long before I was a law enforcement officer, but if you go back in the 60s, that's when things started to evolve in law enforcement, to where there were many more SWAT teams, and I'm not saying bad things about SWAT, because there's a reason that we have fortified vehicles, because there are some people who will do bad things. But the presence of a fortified vehicle, or the presence of a heavily fortified law enforcement officer, can be incredibly intimidating to people who, on the other hand, may support law enforcement or support the protection of their community. So I think that law enforcement has a lot of blame on this. We have to accept some of the blame by stating that we've allowed our budgets to increase exponentially. There's no question about it. And we've justified it by, if we have a single action of barricade a subject, then next year at budget time, we're going to say, well, you remember that incident? It was on the front page of the paper last week of this guy, was holed up, he'd robbed a bank and he was doing all this stuff. Well, now I need to buy this $400,000 vehicle to make sure that our people are protected. And then the elected leaders, the legislative branch of government, whether it's the city council or the board of supervisors, say, well, yeah, we support our cops, and I'm glad they do. So let's buy this piece of equipment. And so the snowball effect of much more militarization of law enforcement has caused almost an us against them situation. And Vance, what I say when people talk about us against them, I will say, I want you to tell me who them is. And as soon as they start telling me who them is, if it's us against them, about halfway through the conversation, they'll realize that there is no them, it's just us. And if somebody says, well, it's law enforcement is us and non-law enforcement is them, I'll say, great. So you're against your parents because they're not law enforcement. So it's you against your parents, us against them. And they'll say, no, my parents support, what I'm doing and law enforcement and so forth. And I will say, you know what, 95% of people out on the street want there to be peacekeepers, want there to be people who use their brain and not take everyone to jail, not write everybody a ticket, but use their brain and make sure that whatever action they're taking is taken for the purpose of protecting their community, and not just because the law says you can do it. Just because you can doesn't mean you should. We've all heard that many times. And as a resident deputy, I learned that a lot of people who I could have taken to jail, I didn't take to jail. I might have taken them home, if they were walking down the street drunk, or I might have followed them to their parents. If they were being a bad driver, I might have said, where do your parents work? And they say at the hardware store. And I would say, I'm going to follow you there. Let's go talk to your dad, and not give him a ticket, but tell the dad, hey, listen, I stopped him because he was doing 60 and a 35. And he really and truly needs to have some kind of privileges taken away from him. And I'm going to say 10 out of 10 times, Vance, those situations worked. But in a big city, a police officer may very possibly never see the same person twice in 10 years. They only see different people every day. And it's a much different type of law enforcement. So if you go back and you look at the beat cops of LAPD, New York City, London, England, they had beat cops that would walk a beat, and they'd go in and say, hey, Mr. Grocery Store owner, how are you today? And grocery store owner would say, hey, I'm good, Mr. Policeman. And, that guy that you were looking for is back in town. You need to watch him. And the police officer would exchange information with the business owner. That's real law enforcement. You're a lot younger than me, but I hope that you've been able to watch Mayberry RFD and Andy Griffith. And those shows, as entertaining as they are, should be taken to heart regarding law enforcement. Of, you're always going to have a town drunk, and you're always going to have a law enforcement officer who needs a little bit more training. All these things come into play, and I liked the Andy Griffith show. I really did. And
that's so interesting that you're. That's really interesting, because as you started that metaphor, I was like, oh, here we go. Tom's going to tell us about the nostalgic age where the police officer was, right, and the humble. But what you're really saying is they were representing, if you have a community, in every community, you are going to have people that are down on their luck. You're going to have people that go too far. You're going to have police officers that are actually not the brightest bulb there. And it's to look at it as a metaphor for, you can't get away from this. There's no society that doesn't have these features within it. And then when you start cramming way more people together, the thing that you said about the us and them, I've lived in major cities. I've lived in Nairobi, New York, DC, and that exact thing happens, because eventually the people that are in front of you never are helping you. They're never asking you about how you're doing. They are only people that are impeding your way to get to doing something else. And they may be perfectly good people, but I can only see them as objects in between me and finishing my day. And if you do that over and over and over again, and your job is to interact at some of the worst moments in people's lives, and they're an other, in order for you to know who you are, you have to say that that's a person that's totally different from me. I can see how you would walk down a path of not treating people like people.
Well, it happens. It certainly happens. And the best example I can have is I was 23 years old. I stopped a guy who was, he may have had too much to drink. I mean, he was right on the border of it. And he lived about a mile from where I stopped him. And it was midnight, and I put him in my car, and we locked his truck up, and I took him home. Now, in California, you can't do that anymore because Mothers Against Drunk Driving have a very strong lobbyist, and the law has changed from you may take a drunk driver to jail to you shall take a drunk driver to jail. But this was before that, and I took him home. Well, about 2 years after that, I was on the side of the highway at 10 o'clock at night, and I had stopped the car, and Vance, this guy was he was fixing to kick my ass. And he was bigger than me. He was stronger than me, and my closest backup was probably a half hour away. And I'm putting myself in a defensive mode, and I do not feel good about this. And I watch this set of headlights, this car coming towards me, and I can hear them and see the headlights shine. They do a U-turn behind my police car. I'm assuming that my backup's here a lot quicker than I thought. And the guy that I had taken home 2 years ago walks up behind me and tells me, I have your back. And
whoa,
holy cow. You go, whoa, I'm pretty tickled right now that my guardian angel is watching over me, and had him driving down that road at that time. And the other guy calmed down, and we handled the situation just with a simple citation. He was mad about a lot of things in life. There was no physical confrontation. And I look back at my life of significant events that have led me to where I am. And that night was a significant event that led me to where I was able to get in law enforcement.
Thanks for checking out this podcast short. If you're interested in the subjects that we're talking about, or the idea of how do you get better at communications, you may want to consider joining the Articulate Ventures Network. There, listeners like you can meet other listeners from all over the world. You can put up talks that you've given to ask for feedback and ways to improve, and you can even take courses that'll help you become a tangibly better communicator. That's the Articulate Ventures Network with the link below.